The morning sun peeped through the curtains of Harold Thompson's modest suburban home, casting long shadows across his wooden floor. At exactly 6:30 a.m., just like every other morning for the past 20 years, the 93-year-old veteran rose from his bed, his joints creaking in protest as he reached for his wire-rimmed glasses on the nightstand. Harold lived alone in the small blue house on Cedar Street, the same house he and his late wife Martha had bought in 1960 after he returned from the war. The neighborhood had changed countless times since then, but Harold's daily routine remained as constant as the North Star. Every morning, he would carefully make his bed with military precision, smoothing out every wrinkle just as he had learned during his service days. His uniform might have been replaced by comfortable khaki pants and a clean button-down shirt, but old habits died hard. The medals and photographs from his World War II service sat proudly displayed on his dresser, collecting a thin film of dust that he dutifully wiped away each Sunday. At 7:15 a.m., Harold stepped out onto his front porch, pausing to admire his garden. The morning dew sparkled on the roses he had planted in Martha's memory, their pink petals reminding him of the dress she wore on their first date. The garden was his pride and joy now, with neat rows of vegetables and flowers that drew admiring glances from passers-by. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," called Mrs. Rodriguez from next door as she collected her morning newspaper. Her children waved from their kitchen window, and Harold smiled, waving back. These small interactions meant the world to him now that Martha was gone. By 8 o'clock a.m., Harold made his way to May's Diner, walking slowly but steadily with his wooden cane. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and May herself looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. "The usual, Harold?" she asked, already reaching for his favorite coffee mug, the one with a slight chip on the rim that he'd been using for the past decade. "Yes, please, May," Harold replied, settling into his regular booth by the window. The vinyl seats were cracked and worn, but to Harold, they were more comfortable than any fancy restaurant's chairs. May brought over his black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs with toast, exactly how he liked them. The diner served as more than just a breakfast spot for Harold. It was where he met his remaining war buddies every Thursday morning. Though their numbers had dwindled over the years, 3 of them still gathered faithfully: Harold, Frank Martinez, and Bill O'Reilly. They shared stories of their grandchildren, complained about their aches and pains, and sometimes, in quieter moments, remembered the friends they'd lost both during and after the war. After breakfast, Harold would walk to the Veterans Center 2 blocks away. The young receptionist, Sarah, always greeted him with genuine warmth. "Got any news stories for us today, Mr. Thompson?" she would ask, knowing how the younger veterans enjoyed hearing about his experiences. Harold spent his mornings at the center, helping where he could. Sometimes he organized files, other times he simply sat and talked with newly returned veterans who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. His calm presence and understanding eyes made him easy to talk to, and many found comfort in sharing their struggles with someone who truly understood. By early afternoon, Harold would return home to tend to his garden. His hands might shake slightly as he pulled weeds or trimmed roses, but his gardening skills remained sharp. The neighbors often stopped to chat, admiring his thriving tomato plants or asking advice about their own gardens. Life had fallen into a comfortable pattern for Harold. The quiet neighborhood, his garden, the diner, and the Veterans Center gave his day structure and purpose. He missed Martha terribly, especially in the evenings when the house grew too quiet, but he found peace in maintaining the life they had built together. Little did Harold know that his peaceful routine was about to be dramatically disrupted. The old warehouse across the street, which had stood empty for years, was about to get new owners, ones who would test not just his patience, but everything he had learned about courage and wisdom in his 93 years of life. The peace of Cedar Street shattered one Monday morning when a convoy of motorcycles roared down the quiet road. Harold stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, as he watched 5 burly men sizing up the old warehouse across from his house. They wore black leather vests with a logo he couldn't quite make out, their motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun. Over the next few days, Harold observed a flurry of activity at the warehouse. Workers came and went, carrying building materials and equipment. The sound of power tools and hammering filled the air, disrupting the birdsong Harold usually enjoyed while tending his garden. A large sign appeared above the warehouse entrance: Iron Wolves MC Clubhouse. "Did you hear about the motorcycle club moving in?" May asked when Harold arrived for his usual breakfast that Friday. Her normally cheerful face showed concern as she poured his coffee. They bought the whole building last month. City Council approved it without much discussion. Harold simply nodded, trying to keep an open mind. After all, he had been young once too, and he remembered how the older folks used to complain about the noise from victory celebrations when he returned from the war. Maybe they'll turn out to be good neighbors, he said, though the worried looks from other regular customers suggested they didn't share his optimism. That weekend, the Iron Wolves held their grand opening party. The quiet afternoon air was filled with the thunderous roar of dozens of motorcycles as club members from neighboring cities arrived to celebrate. Music blasted from massive speakers they'd set up outside, and the smell of barbecue and beer wafted across the street to Harold's porch. Harold tried to focus on his crossword puzzle, but the noise made it impossible to concentrate. Around midnight, when the party showed no signs of winding down, he decided to take action. Straightening his collar and grabbing his cane, he walked across the street with as much dignity as he could muster. A young man with tattoos covering his arms stood at the entrance. "Well, look what we got here," he called out to his friends. "Grandpa's come to join the party." Several others laughed, but Harold kept his composure. "Good evening," Harold said politely, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm your neighbor from across the street. I was wondering if you might consider turning down the music a bit. Some of us early risers need to get some sleep." The tattooed man, who introduced himself as Snake, looked Harold up and down with amusement. "Sorry, old-timer. Club tradition says we party till sunrise on opening night. Maybe get yourself some earplugs." More laughter followed this suggestion. As Harold turned to leave, he heard one of them mock his slow, measured walk. "Hey, Gramps, need a walker to go with that cane." Another voice added, "Better hurry home before your bedtime." The next few weeks brought more changes to Cedar Street. The quiet mornings Harold cherished were now regularly interrupted by motorcycles revving their engines. Empty beer cans occasionally found their way onto his carefully maintained lawn, and the club members seemed to take special delight in making extra noise whenever they saw him in his garden. One morning, Harold found his newspaper in a puddle near his driveway instead of on his porch where the delivery person usually left it. When he looked up, he saw several club members watching from their doorway, snickering. They had clearly moved it on purpose, but Harold chose not to confront them. Instead, he picked up his soaked newspaper and went inside, his hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and disappointment. The other neighbors began to change their routines too. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped letting her children play in the front yard. The evening dog walkers chose different routes. Even the mail carrier started delivering to Harold's house earlier, avoiding the times when club members usually gathered outside their clubhouse. Harold found himself spending more time inside, watching through his windows as his peaceful neighborhood transformed. The garden he loved so much became harder to tend as the constant noise and harassment made him feel unwelcome in his own front yard. At night, lying in his bed and listening to the rumble of motorcycles, he thought of Martha and wondered what she would advise him to do. The final straw hadn't come yet, but Harold could feel it approaching. As he sat in his favorite chair that evening, looking at old photographs of his war buddies, he realized that sooner or later, he would have to make a choice about how to handle this situation. He just didn't know yet what that choice would be. The situation on Cedar Street grew worse with each passing day. Harold tried to maintain his usual routine, but the Iron Wolves seemed determined to make his life difficult. Every morning when he stepped out for his walk to May's Diner, at least one club member would rev their engine loudly, startling him. They had learned his schedule and used it against him. One particularly humid Tuesday morning, Harold noticed something different about his garden. Several of his prized tomato plants had been crushed, with motorcycle tire tracks clearly visible in the soft soil. His hands shook as he knelt to examine the damage, his old knees protesting against the movement. The sound of laughter from across the street told him this was no accident. At May's Diner, Harold's friends noticed the change in him. His shoulders slumped more than usual, and he stirred his coffee absently, barely touching his breakfast. "You don't look so good, Harold," Frank Martinez said during their Thursday morning veterans meeting. "Those bikers still giving you trouble?" Harold nodded slowly. "It's getting worse," he admitted. "Yesterday, they followed me halfway to the Veterans Center, revving their engines and making rude gestures. I tried calling the police, but they said they can't do anything unless there's property damage or physical threats." Bill O'Reilly, the youngest of their group at 85, slammed his fist on the table. This isn't right. We fought for this country. We deserve some peace in our old age. Several other diner patrons turned to look at them, but quickly turned away when they saw the bikers through the window, lounging against their motorcycles across the street. May came over to refill their coffee cups, her face lined with worry. "They were in here last night," she whispered. "Made a mess of the place and scared away my regular customers. But I'm afraid to file a complaint. They know where I live." That afternoon, Harold decided to make one more attempt at peaceful resolution. He put on his best shirt, the blue one Martha had given him for their last anniversary together, and walked across the street to the clubhouse. The strong smell of cigarettes and beer assaulted his nostrils as he approached. "Look who it is, boys." Snake called out from his usual spot by the entrance. The old-timers back for another visit. A group of bikers gathered around, forming a loose circle around Harold. Their leather vests gleamed with patches and pins, and their boots scraped against the concrete as they moved closer. Harold stood as straight as his aged spine would allow. "I came to talk about respect," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This neighborhood has been my home for over 60 years. All I'm asking is for some basic courtesy." Snake stepped forward, towering over Harold. "Respect," he sneered. "You want respect? This ain't your neighborhood anymore, old man. Times change. Maybe it's time for you to move to one of those old folks' homes where you belong." The other bikers laughed, and one of them blew cigarette smoke directly into Harold's face, making him cough. Another knocked his cane aside with a heavy boot, forcing Harold to stumble to keep his balance. "Oops," the man said with fake concern. "Better be careful there, Grandpa. Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Harold retrieved his cane and turned to leave, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation. As he walked away, he heard them mocking his military service. "Hey boys, better watch out. The old war hero might come after us with his walker." That night Harold couldn't sleep. The constant rumble of motorcycles from the clubhouse mixed with memories of war in his dreams. He remembered the courage it took to face enemy fire, the brotherhood he shared with his fellow soldiers, and the pride they felt in serving their country. Now, decades later, he was being bullied in the very country he had fought to protect. The next morning, Harold found more damage to his property. Someone had spray-painted crude words across his front fence, and his mailbox had been knocked over. As he stood there, staring at the destruction, something changed in his eyes. The defeated look of recent weeks was replaced by a familiar determination, one his fellow soldiers would have recognized from their days in combat. Harold slowly turned and looked up at his attic window, where he kept his old military trunk. He hadn't opened it in years, but maybe it was time. Not for weapons or violence. Harold knew better than that. No, he had something much more powerful in mind. The Iron Wolves were about to learn that this old veteran still had some fight left in him, just not the kind they were expecting. The news about Harold's confrontation with the Iron Wolves spread quickly through Cedar Street. People whispered about it at the supermarket, discussed it in hushed tones at church, and shared worried glances when motorcycles roared past their homes. The once friendly neighborhood had become a place of tension and fear. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped Harold one morning as he walked to May's diner. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before speaking. "Mr. Thompson, my husband and I, we feel terrible about what's happening," she said, wringing her hands. "But we have young children. We can't risk getting involved." Her eyes filled with tears as she hurried back inside, leaving Harold standing alone on the sidewalk. At the local police station, Officer Jenkins sat across from Harold, reviewing his latest complaint. The young policeman's face showed genuine concern, but his words offered little hope. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration," he said, shuffling through the paperwork. "But unless we have clear evidence of serious crimes, our hands are tied. Noise complaints and suspicious activity reports aren't enough for us to take action." Harold noticed how Officer Jenkins' eyes kept darting to the window, where 3 motorcycles were parked across the street. Even the police seemed hesitant to challenge the Iron Wolves directly. The situation at May's diner grew worse. The morning crowd that once filled the restaurant had dwindled to just a handful of regulars. The bikers had claimed the diner as their territory during evening hours, driving away other customers with their loud behavior and intimidating presence. "My business is dying, Harold," May confided one quiet morning, her usually cheerful face lined with worry. Last night they broke 3 coffee cups and left without paying their bill. But when I mentioned calling the police, they just laughed and said nobody would believe an old lady like me. Harold's Thursday morning veterans group had shrunk too. Bill O'Reilly stopped coming after his car tires were mysteriously slashed. Frank Martinez still attended but changed his route to avoid passing the clubhouse. Only Harold maintained his regular schedule, refusing to let fear change his routine. One afternoon, Reverend Williams from the local church tried to mediate. He walked into the clubhouse hoping to appeal to the biker's better nature. 20 minutes later, he emerged with a pale face and shaking hands. He never spoke about what happened inside, but he stopped including the Iron Wolves in his Sunday prayers for the community. The local newspaper ran a small story about the changing neighborhood, but it was carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of the motorcycle club. The reporter who wrote it was seen apologetically buying drinks for the Iron Wolves the next day. Harold watched all this from his front porch, noting how people now hurried past the clubhouse with their heads down. Parents walked their children to school using longer routes to avoid Seder Street. The ice cream truck that used to visit every Sunday stopped coming altogether. Some neighbors even put their houses up for sale. "Can't live like this anymore," Mr. Peterson told Harold as he hammered a for sale sign into his front yard. 30 years I've lived here, but enough is enough. My wife hasn't had a good night's sleep in weeks." The local community center, which used to host weekly bingo nights and community meetings, canceled most evening activities. Due to recent changes in the neighborhood dynamic, the notice read, but everyone knew what it really meant. The Iron Wolves had managed to disrupt not just individual lives, but the entire social fabric of the community. One evening, Harold sat in his living room, looking through old photographs of the neighborhood. There was the block party from '85, the Christmas caroling group from '92, last year's garden competition. Each image showed smiling faces and a strong sense of community, everything that was now slipping away. The sound of breaking glass interrupted his thoughts. Harold looked out his window to see 3 bikers throwing empty bottles at Mrs. Johnson's cat as it tried to cross the street. The elderly woman watched helplessly from her window, too afraid to go out and rescue her pet. That night, as Harold lay in bed listening to the now familiar sound of revving engines and loud music, he made a decision. The community might be too afraid to stand up to the Iron Wolves, but he wasn't. Tomorrow, he would climb into his attic and open that old military trunk. Inside were not just medals and memories, but something that might just change everything: the power of history and truth. The morning that changed everything started like any other, but it would end very differently. Harold woke up at his usual time, made his bed with military precision, and went to check on his garden. What he saw made his old heart nearly stop. The memorial rose bush, the one he had planted on his first wedding anniversary with Martha, lay destroyed. The delicate pink roses that reminded him of her favorite dress were scattered across the lawn, their petals trampled into the mud. Motorcycle tracks cut deep through the flower bed, and a half-empty beer bottle stuck out of the soil like a cruel marker. Harold stood there, his hands trembling on his cane, as he stared at the destruction. Across the street, several Iron Wolves members lounged on their motorcycles, watching his reaction with obvious amusement. Snake, their leader, raised his coffee cup in a mocking toast. "Having some garden troubles, old-timer?" Snake called out, earning laughs from his companions. "Maybe it's time to give up the gardening hobby. Wouldn't want you hurting yourself out there." For the first time since Martha's passing, Harold felt tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. This rose bush had been more than just a plant. It was his last living connection to Martha. They had tended it together for 40 years, and after she passed, caring for it had become his way of honoring her memory. Instead of going to May's diner, Harold went back inside his house. His breakfast friends would understand. With determined steps, he climbed the narrow stairs to his attic, his joints protesting every step. He hadn't been up here in years, but he knew exactly what he was looking for. The old military trunk sat in the corner, covered in dust but still solid. Harold ran his hand over the faded name stenciled on its lid. "That's it. H. Thompson, U.S. Army." The brass lock was stiff, but the key still worked. As he lifted the heavy lid, memories flooded back. Inside, carefully preserved, lay the pieces of his military life. His uniform, still crisply folded despite the decades. The American flag that had draped his father's coffin. letters from Martha during his service. But what he sought lay at the bottom, wrapped in clean cloth. Harold's hands shook as he unwrapped his medals. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed in the dim attic light, along with his Purple Heart and other decorations. Beneath them lay yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs, evidence of his unit's role in liberating a French village from Nazi occupation. There were other items too, official military documents detailing his acts of bravery, letters of commendation from his commanding officers, and most importantly, a detailed account of how his unit had saved an entire town while minimizing civilian casualties through careful planning rather than brute force. As Harold held these precious items, a new kind of strength flowed through him. These weren't just pieces of metal and paper. They were proof of a life dedicated to protecting others, of battles fought not for glory, but for justice and peace. He thought about how his unit had faced impossible odds during the war. They hadn't won their battles through superior firepower or intimidation, but through strategy, courage, and unity. Maybe those same principles could work here, on Cedar Street. Harold began to carefully select certain items from the trunk, placing them in a small cardboard box. His medals, yes, but also the photographs and newspaper clippings that told the fuller story. He added the official citation for his Distinguished Service Cross, which detailed how he had saved his entire platoon through quick thinking and diplomacy rather than violence. As he worked, Harold heard motorcycles revving outside, their noise seemingly louder than ever. But for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. Looking out his attic window, Harold could see the iron wolves in their usual spots, laughing and causing trouble. They thought they knew him, just a frail old man they could bully and mock. But they didn't know Sergeant Harold Thompson, the soldier who had faced down tanks with nothing but courage and cleverness. By sunset, Harold had everything he needed. His plan wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about showing these young men something they didn't expect, the true meaning of strength, honor, and respect. Tomorrow, he would begin his campaign, not with fists or threats, but with truth and dignity. As he closed the trunk, Harold smiled for the first time since finding his destroyed garden. Martha would have approved of this plan. After all, she had always said that the best victories are won with wisdom, not weapons. The next morning, Harold put on his best suit, the one he wore to veterans' ceremonies, and made his way to the local news station. The young receptionist at Channel 5 News looked up in surprise as the elderly veteran walked in, carrying his cardboard box of memories with careful dignity. "I have a story to tell," Harold said quietly, placing his Distinguished Service Cross on her desk. The medal caught the fluorescent light, drawing the attention of a passing reporter named Sarah Chen. She stopped, curious about the elderly man in his press suit with military medals. "Would you mind telling me about these?" Sarah asked, pulling up a chair. For the next hour, Harold shared his story, not just about the current troubles with the Iron Wolves, but about his service, his life, and the changing face of his beloved neighborhood. Sarah's eyes grew wider as he showed her the newspaper clippings and photographs from his military days. "This isn't just about an old man being harassed," Harold explained, his voice steady. "It's about a community living in fear. It's about respect for the very freedoms I and many others fought to protect." He shared videos that neighbors had secretly recorded of the bikers' intimidation tactics, along with police reports that had gone nowhere. Sarah's story aired the following evening. The headline read, "Decorated World War II Veteran Faces New Battle on Home Front." The piece was powerful in its simplicity, showing Harold tending his destroyed garden, holding Martha's picture, and explaining how the neighborhood had changed. His military records and medals added weight to his words. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Local veterans groups shared it on social media. Then national veterans organizations picked it up. By the end of the week, Harold's story had gone viral, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Letters and emails began pouring into the news station. Many were from veterans and their families, expressing outrage at how Harold was being treated. Others came from people who had faced similar problems with intimidation in their own communities but had been afraid to speak up. The Iron Wolves noticed the changing atmosphere. Fewer people lowered their eyes when passing their clubhouse now. Instead, strangers drove by slowly, taking pictures and shooting disapproving looks. Some even stopped to place flowers by Harold's destroyed rose bush. Snake and his gang tried to maintain their tough image, but the increased attention made them uncomfortable. Police cars started patrolling Cedar Street more frequently, and officers no longer looked the other way when they spotted violations. Local businesses that had been intimidated into silence began speaking out. May shared security camera footage of the bikers threatening her customers. Other shop owners came forward with similar stories. The newspaper that had been afraid to criticize the Iron Wolves now ran daily updates on the situation. Harold remained calm throughout it all, continuing his daily routine despite his newfound fame. He still walked to May's diner every morning, though now people stopped him to shake his hand or thank him for his service. He politely declined interviews from national news networks, letting his initial story speak for itself. The most surprising support came from other motorcycle clubs. Legitimate riding groups were angry that the Iron Wolves were tarnishing their reputation. Several veteran-owned motorcycle clubs reached out to Sarah Chen, wanting to connect with Harold. "What you did took real courage," the president of the Patriot Riders told Harold during a phone call. "Not all bikers are like those troublemakers. We respect our veterans, our communities, and our country. We'd like to help if you'll let us." Harold considered the offer carefully. He remembered what his commanding officer had taught him during the war. Sometimes the best way to win is to transform your opponents into allies. Looking out his window at the Iron Wolves clubhouse, he made another decision. "Yes," he told the Patriot Riders president. "I think it's time these young men learned about real brotherhood and respect." As he hung up the phone, Harold smiled. Phase 1 of his plan had worked better than he'd hoped. Now it was time for Phase 2, turning enemies into friends. Across the street, the Iron Wolves watched nervously as their phones buzzed with messages from other motorcycle clubs. They were about to learn that their actions had consequences they never expected, and the old veteran they had dismissed was far more strategic than they had realized. The rumble of motorcycles on Cedar Street had a different sound that Saturday morning. Instead of the usual threatening roar of the Iron Wolves, it was the disciplined arrival of over 200 veteran bikers that came from all across the state: Patriot Riders, Veterans Legion Riders, and other respected motorcycle clubs. Harold stood on his porch, watching as the riders parked in neat rows. Unlike the chaos of the Iron Wolves, these bikers moved with military precision. Many wore vests decorated with service patches and American flags. Their leader, a tall man named Jack Sergeant Wilson, approached Harold and saluted smartly. "Sergeant Thompson," Jack said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of military service. "The cavalry has arrived, sir." Behind him, other veteran riders stood at attention, showing respect that brought tears to Harold's eyes. Across the street, the Iron Wolves gathered outside their clubhouse, looking uncertain for the first time. Snake tried to maintain his tough appearance, but his usual swagger was missing as he watched the organized arrival of so many experienced riders. "We're not here for trouble," Jack announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're here for education." He walked across the street toward the Iron Wolves, his movements calm but purposeful. Other veteran riders followed, creating a bridge between the two groups. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of confrontation, the veteran riders began sharing stories. They set up grills in the street, creating an impromptu community barbecue. The smell of hamburgers and hot dogs drew curious neighbors from their homes. "My grandfather was in World War II," one young Iron Wolf member said quietly to Harold as they stood near the grill. His name was Tommy, and he was one of the newer club members. He never talked about it much, but he had medals like yours. Harold saw an opening. He invited Tommy and a few others to look at his military memorabilia. Soon, several Iron Wolves members were sitting in Harold's living room, listening as he shared stories about brotherhood, sacrifice, and real courage. "See this photograph?" Harold said, pointing to a yellowed image. "These men were my brothers. We didn't intimidate people to earn respect. We earned it by protecting others, by standing up for what was right." Snake watched from the doorway as his members became engaged in Harold's stories. The veteran riders had been right. This wasn't about force or humiliation. It was about understanding and redemption. As the day progressed, more neighbors joined the gathering. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas. May arrived with coffee and pie from the diner. The street that had been divided by fear became a place of healing and connection. Jack and other veteran riders shared their own experiences with the Iron Wolves. teaching them about motorcycle club traditions that focused on community service and brotherhood. They explained how many legitimate motorcycle clubs worked with charities, supported veterans, and helped their neighborhoods. "You've got it backwards," Jack told Snake. "Real respect isn't taken by force, it's earned through actions that lift people up, not tear them down." The transformation wasn't instant, but it was profound. Some Iron Wolves members looked ashamed as they realized how they had behaved. Others seemed relieved to have a path toward redemption. Tommy approached Harold late in the afternoon. "Mr. Thompson," he said, shuffling his feet. "Some of us were wondering, would you help us clean up your garden tomorrow? And maybe tell us more about your time in the service?" Harold smiled warmly. "I'd like that very much," he replied. "And perhaps you young men could help me plant a new rose bush for Martha." As the sun set on Cedar Street, the atmosphere had changed completely. The veteran riders had accomplished something remarkable, not through intimidation or violence, but through understanding and respect. Snake, who had been quiet most of the day, finally approached Harold. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. "We've been acting like fools," he admitted. "Your generation fought real battles, faced real challenges. We've just been playing at being tough." Harold placed a gentle hand on Snake's shoulder. "It's never too late to change course, son," he said. "The measure of a man isn't in how much fear he can cause, but in how much good he can do." The veteran riders departed as orderly as they had arrived, but they left behind a changed neighborhood. The Iron Wolves had seen a different kind of strength, one built on respect, service, and genuine brotherhood. Cedar Street would never be quite the same, but perhaps it would be something better. 1 month after the veteran riders' visit, Cedar Street had become a different place. The morning sun shone down on the Iron Wolves clubhouse, but now the building sported a fresh coat of paint and a new sign that read Iron Wolves Veterans Support Chapter. The constant roar of motorcycles had been replaced by the sounds of community and friendship. Harold sat in his usual spot at May's Diner, enjoying his morning coffee. The diner was busier than ever, with Iron Wolves members respectfully sharing space with other customers. Snake, wearing a cleaned-up version of his leather vest, approached Harold's table. "Mind if I join you, sir?" Snake asked, his former arrogance replaced by genuine respect. Harold gestured to the empty chair, and Snake sat down with his own cup of coffee. "The rose bush is blooming nicely," Snake said, referring to the new memorial plant the club had helped install in Harold's garden. "Tommy's been reading up on gardening. Says he wants to start a community garden in that empty lot behind the clubhouse." Harold smiled, remembering how the young bikers had worked tirelessly to restore his garden. They hadn't just replanted the roses. They'd added new flowers, fixed the fence, and even installed better lighting for security. The Iron Wolves had undergone a remarkable transformation. Under the mentorship of the veteran riders groups, they'd reformed their club's mission. Weekly motorcycle maintenance classes for neighborhood kids had replaced late-night parties. The sound of engines now meant community service runs were starting, not trouble brewing. "Grandfather would have been proud," Tommy said, joining them with a plate of maize pancakes. Like many club members, he discovered his own connection to military service through Harold's stories. "We found his medals in my mom's attic. Never knew he was at Normandy, too." The clubhouse had become a gathering place for local veterans, with Harold's influence visible everywhere. Military photographs and American flags hung on walls that once displayed intimidating imagery. A weekly veterans support group met in the newly renovated backroom, where Iron Wolves members served coffee and listened to stories from their elders. Mrs. Rodriguez's children now played freely in their front yard, often waving to the bikers who kept a protective eye on the neighborhood. The club members had even started a neighborhood watch program, working with Officer Jenkins to keep the streets safe. The State Veterans Organization called again, Snake mentioned, showing Harold a letter on his phone. "They want us to help start similar programs in other cities. They're calling it the Thompson Initiative, using motorcycle clubs to support veterans and build community." Harold felt pride warm his chest. The change hadn't just affected Cedar Street, it was spreading. Other motorcycle clubs were reaching out to veterans in their areas, transforming their image from intimidating to inspiring. That afternoon, Harold watched from his porch as Iron Wolves members taught local kids about motorcycle safety in the clubhouse parking lot. Each child wore a tiny leather vest, decorated not with scary patches but with positive messages about respect and community service. Martha would have loved this, Harold whispered to himself, touching the blooming rose that honored her memory. The garden had become a symbol of the neighborhood's transformation, with community members often stopping to admire the flowers or share a quiet moment of reflection. As evening approached, the Iron Wolves gathered for their weekly ride, but now, instead of causing fear, they rode with purpose, delivering meals to homebound veterans, visiting hospitals, or helping other communities start their own support programs. Snake helped Harold down the porch steps. "Ready for the meeting, sir?" he asked. The club had made Harold an honorary member, and his advice was sought on all important decisions. His military experience and wisdom had become valuable guides for the reformed organization. Inside the clubhouse, Harold looked around at the faces of young men who had become like sons to him. Where there had once been anger and misguided aggression, he now saw purpose and pride. They had learned that true strength came not from intimidation, but from service to others. As Harold took his place at the meeting table, he remembered something his commanding officer had said during the war. "The greatest victories are the ones that bring people together." Looking at the transformed Iron Wolves and the renewed spirit of Cedar Street, Harold knew he had won his final and perhaps most important battle, not with fists or force, but with wisdom, patience, and understanding. The Iron Wolves had become guardians instead of troublemakers, protectors instead of intimidators. And Harold, the 93-year-old veteran they had once mocked, had become their most respected teacher, showing them that real power lies not in causing fear, but in earning respect through actions that lift up the entire community.